Welcome to my second episode of the Never Ending Experiment, my new podcast. I'd like to talk about animation this episode. I'm fresh from the Quick Draw Animation Society's 40th year reunion, the anniversary for this society, which is in Calgary, Alberta, where I've spent most of my life. And it was really inspiring to go to this reunion. It was a bit of a mini festival, and decades of animation and animation appreciation were showcased over the Canada Day long weekend in Calgary. What's so interesting about Quick Draw, it is kind of a one of a kind place. Animation is a very solitary art form, especially if you're doing independent animation. Of course, there are animation studios for larger productions. But when you're actually animating, it is a very solitary. It's a very solitary art form, and so creating a community around a group of people who are generally off by themselves in isolation is kind of an exciting thing. It's a bit of a contradiction, but I think it works really well. The thing about Quick Draw is, of course, it is an organization. It is a society. It was started in the early 80s by a group of people who were not animators. They were actually just people who really appreciated independent animation and wanted a place to go to see some of the different kinds of animation that are out there. And there really is a lot of different kinds of animation in the world. I mean, outside of the commercial studios, there's so much going on. And I think it's one of the most fascinating art forms in existence. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the weirder, deeper things about animation. I first got started in 2001 in a elective that was held at the Quick Draw facilities, and it was through the Alberta College of Art and Design, which is what it was called then. It's changed its name a few times over the years. And Kevin Kritnick was the instructor then, and he has since gone to expand the animation program at the college, which is now a university. At the time, the elective was the only animation course that was available. And after I took it, I kind of just fell in love with animation and decided to pursue it. So, right after I was done, I went to New Zealand. And while I was there, I actually applied to Concordia University in Montreal. And I ended up getting my degree in Montreal in film animation. And some of the early thoughts that I had about that, I wrote an essay while I was going to art school about animation and how it is, I think, the closest imitation to human consciousness that we have as an art form. And that's because you can create pretty much anything you want in your imagination and put it into an animated form. Not that that's an easy process. Usually in the translation, you'll come up with something a little bit different because animation has its own constraints. But overall, it is really amazing how much you can imitate things that you can't really see in any other way other than by using animation. Any art form, painting, textiles, you can do animation with them because animation is essentially it's micro video editing. And so you're taking one image at a time. Even this video, all videos and all film out there are just a series of single static images that are put together, and then your eye will perceive what seems to be movement, and it's just a rapid change of images from one to the other. It's a fascinating art form, and I really fell in love with it. I thought if I can do this one course and do a film that I like, then I'm going to stick with it. And I did. And I had been at art school for almost 5 years, and I didn't really know what I was going to do. And then animation just lit up something in me because I was able to tell a story with it. And I think that's the other exciting part about animation is, when you're telling a story about something that's fantastical, there's no real way to show it. We've had a lot of history in theater. But what animation does is it takes theater and it takes painting and takes all these traditional art forms and it mixes them together in a really fascinating way. I've also discovered recently, because I always thought of this, the animation, the stop motion frame by frame animation is purely a visual thing. And I was watching a little documentary about Billie Eilish and her brother Phineas, and how he actually puts together these tiny little clips of sound one after the other. And I realized that they're animating with sound. So you can also do frame by frame sound animation, which is pretty incredible. Um, I think that there are a lot of misperceptions about animation out there, especially about technology. I think a lot of people think that when computer animation became more common, that it was just sort of doing all the work and you just sort of input a few things and then the computer will put together an animation for you. Although that may be the case more recently, but that's just because people actually did make these templates and made them more user friendly. But the technology of computer animation actually just makes the whole thing more complex, and so you actually need more skill to understand how to do computer animation instead of less so. People really want that, what I was saying, to create a visual representation of something that's going on in their head with animation. And so they get into it thinking they're going to be able to do that easily, but it's actually quite a difficult art form. And that's just because you have to recreate every single image. And if you are using a computer, animated program where you don't have to redo every single image, you still have to input a lot of information in order to get a nice kind of movement that looks realistic. Realism is less important in animation than believability. So when you're creating something, it doesn't have to be real. You don't expect it to be real. And I actually prefer animation that does push the boundaries a little bit, because I almost think if you're imitating real life, then what's the point of even doing an animation? You might as well just do a live action if you're just going to imitate reality that much. So creating a fantasy world that's believable is the goal of animation. And there's so many micro movements that we don't even perceive. And I think learning animation, that was one of the most interesting things that can give you a bit of a God complex. And I think that, animators do have a bit of that when you find out that you're basically creating life. It's like there was nothing there and I created these images and now there's something that seems to be real. It's a fascinating thing to do. And it's a bit of a high, and it can get you addicted to animation. And I think when people get into it, it's sort of a either you really like it or you really don't. And there are a lot of people that do dabble in animation, other kinds of artists and other people that give it a try because it's so interesting to understand it. But then they find out just how labor intensive it is and how much work it is, and they just back away from it. So it's something that you may, if you are thinking about trying animation, absolutely try it. But you can look at yourself and see if if you're an obsessive person, and if you're very detail oriented and you don't mind repetitive activity, then you may love animation. But if you're impatient and you think that the computer is going to do all the work for you, you're probably going to be in for a big disappointment. So you may prefer just to enjoy watching animation rather than trying to make one of your own. I did try teaching animation and I found it kind of challenging, I think, for that very reason. So my education is in traditional 2D animation. So that's basically just drawings that you take pictures of and input it into either a film camera or a digital camera. And today, the almost everybody uses some digital software for animation, usually for testing. There are people that still work on film, on emulsion film. Some people even work directly on film. That's a really interesting technique. So you basically scratch and bleach or use dyes or paints directly on the film, and then you can screen it, and it has a really fascinating effect. But you're working very, very tiny, and usually animators work very small, which is very strange to think of, especially when you see an animation in the theater, which is a huge silver screen, right? It could be like, I don't know how many feet high, a whole story high. But yet the actual film that it was made on is sometimes very, very small, maybe less than a full page of paper. So maybe like 4 inches by 5 inches or something very small. And of course, if you're working digitally, most screens are pretty small as well. So it's a fascinating thing to see something so tiny projected into a large format. The other thing is the ergonomics of looking at a screen a lot, and I know a lot of people today suffer from the side effects of being in front of a screen, and it can be very hard on your eyes. And I know that's one thing that we didn't have at animation school was that nobody really realized that you should have windows next to your computer so you can look outside and readjust your eyes. And my eye doctor actually did tell me that I was having trouble after my first year in animation, so I had to really change and stop staring at the light table so much, because that's usually how animations are drawn. If you're doing hand drawn animation, you have to look at a light table because it will shine through and show the different levels, the different layers of paper, so that you can see the movements and imagine how that's going to look. If you've ever watched a documentary on animation, they put their fingers through the different pieces of paper and go back and forth and like flick them around to see how the animation is going to look. And of course, so now we have digital programs that are very easy to capture those images and test them out pretty easily. So if it's not working, then you can redo it pretty easily. Well, what did I say? Easily. There's nothing really easy about animation. Usually, if you're going to do some character animation, you should expect to have to redo it a few times. And because it's all about movement and it's not just about looking pretty, to make a movement realistic is a very complicated thing. And one of the fun things about animation is that it really makes you observe movement in details that you're not normally aware of. You start looking at people walk, you start imagining what their hip bones are doing and their knees and their hands, if they're moving their hands when they walk. And secondary motion, the secondary motion is the things that move based on another movement. So it's like a domino effect, and human beings and other organisms move in a certain way that's not mechanical. It's not stop and go. Usually, before you make a movement, there's this tiny little movement in the opposite direction that happens. And then after the movement, like I said, there's a secondary motion or tertiary motion. So you're walking, and as you come to a stop, your hands come to a stop after, and your whole body goes into a relaxed position. So it's a series of steps, a series of movements, and you really have to analyze those when you get into animation. If you try to simplify a walk cycle, it's not going to look very realistic. So, something that's kind of interesting that I've looked at when I come back to the idea of consciousness and how animation imitates consciousness, you have to look at what it is that makes us perceive movement out of these static images. And there's different theories behind it. It's not as simple as they might say. The most common understanding of it is called persistence of vision. And, if you've ever looked at a bright light and then you close your eyes, even if I'm doing it now, I can see a whole bunch of lights behind my eyes because I've been looking at light. And so your retina reacts to those and it will continue to react for a little while. So if you're looking at a bright light and you close your eyes, it's going to take quite a few seconds for that light, that perception of light, the negative image in your retina to go away. So when you're looking at an animation, you're taking in these images and your retina is kind of holding on to those images. So they call that persistence of vision, so that you see one image and then the more images will add on to that. And so because your brain's remembering and your eyes are remembering what you just saw, it's creating a smoother perception of motion. When I dug a little deeper into that question, though, I found that there's a little bit more going on in your brain, and that your brain is actually editing a lot of the things that you're seeing. So it's creating even more of a perception of motion. And they did some tests showing how they put these electrodes on a person's arm and had them going up the arm, but not necessarily at regular intervals. And then they did these little pulsating sensations up the arm. And the person couldn't see anything, they could just feel it. And they had the perception that those little sensations were going regularly up their arm, but they weren't. So there is this strange thing that happens that we're perceiving regular motion going up the arm when in fact those little sensations were actually irregular. They weren't going regularly up the arm at all, but our brain expects a smooth motion and a smooth sensation. So it's a very weird thing that our brains kind of want to see that. However, if you do an animation and you mix up the drawings and you have this aberration, it will stand out because you're moving away from that motion. Same thing if you have those sensations going up your arm and then they go backwards, you'll perceive that. But if they go all in one direction and they go smoothly enough, your brain will interpret that as a regular motion. So animation really works at a deep level of consciousness. And I think when you're animating as well, because it's so slow, you allow that intuitive flow to kind of come in and guide you in different ways. And it's pretty rare to do an animation unless you're in a commercial studio and you have certain requirements and a bunch of people working on the same thing. You have to follow exactly what they've laid out. But if you're doing it on your own, you can sort of allow yourself to go in different directions, and it can get very different than what you sort of first expect. Another thing, when I was at animation school, I remember one of my fellow students came in and said, "I think I've broke through the space-time continuum." And I don't know if that's true. I don't really know what happened, but I know that when you work with time and space, because you're creating this perception of space, and animation is very much working with time, it can feel like you're breaking through into some other level of consciousness as well. That doing a lot of animation will change how you perceive time and change how you perceive movement, and how you feel. So it's it can be a very deep art form to get into, and to make you really see things differently. There are not a lot of art forms that are that varied or complex. When I went to art school, weaving, I think, was sort of similar in that you were using a lot of left brain activities, so a lot of math. Animation and music, of course, are also very complementary. As I mentioned before, you can animate with sound as well. So I don't think I'm finished with animation. Going back to the 40th reunion made me really wonder what my place is in it now. I think after I first quit, it was sort of sad, and I just felt like I needed space away from animation because it was just reminding me of what I wasn't able to do. But now I realize that there's a lot of opportunity for non-animators in the animation world, and a lot of people that worked at QuickDraw and that work there now are not necessarily animators. They just appreciate animation, and the more that you learn about it, the more you can appreciate how much effort it takes for an animator to put into the film. When you're watching, just a few minutes of animation on a TV show, that's hours of work that went into that. And so it's something that you really appreciate. And I think the thing when I was teaching is I was teaching traditional animation, and I wasn't teaching computer software as much. And so the people that expected it to be easy because it was computer animation were pretty upset when I was asking them to do detailed drawings and multiple drawings. But if you're going to get started, if you don't have any drawing ability and you want to get into animation, then you sure better have some sculptural skills or something so that you can do 3D stop motion or something like that. Or even if you want to get into 3D digital animation, you have to have some sculptural sensibility, and that's why I never went anywhere near that, because I'm very much a 2D person. It's just how my brain works. Like I don't have great depth perception, I guess. And, I'm not that good at dealing with things that are in space. I took perspective a bunch of times, and I'm like, okay, well, this is interesting, but it's is not really my thing. It's amazing that they discovered how to create that kind of depth in a painting or in a drawing. But I just really like working with sort of that mental aspect of drawing, and just working in a 2D flat space. That's just how I am, and everybody has their own sensibilities with that. Going to quick draw and my own, just to go over a little bit more of my history with animation and with Canada. The National Film Board, when I was growing up, always had these short films that they showed on CBC, and often they were between different programs, and so you'd be watching something, and then the Log Driver's Waltz would come on, or The Cat Came Back, or a lot of these classic NFB films. Nowadays, things have changed a lot, because sometimes I think, wow, that was my biggest inspiration to going into animation. I was already pretty aware at that time, 21, 22, that Disney was, it's a massive industry now. It's a huge company. They're not the greatest at the arts. They've pushed the technical side of animation a lot, and Walt Disney definitely pushed the technical side of animation in a way that was very influential on other artists. But there's also a lot of backlash. And, anybody that grew up with the Looney Tunes knows how rebellious and violent and sarcastic those shows are, because they were kind of reacting to the super cutesy, family oriented perception of what Walt Disney was doing, which was it's fantasy. They're all fantasies, different kinds of fantasy. And so some of the other animators that came out of that pushed the art form in a different way, at least culturally. So I was already a little disillusioned about Disney by the time I started. I think I lost my interest somewhere between The Little Mermaid and The Lion King. And I think it's when you realize that Disney is a business, and most big Hollywood productions are a business. So they care about making money, and they care about appealing to the largest group of people possible. But that does mean that they often lose out on originality, because originality in that industry is seen as a risk. Sometimes it's a risk that will pay off, and sometimes people really enjoy seeing something brand new. But a lot of times people are afraid of it and they don't want to follow that. You can see, like using a lot of the older stories, Hans Christian Andersen, these old European stories that were made into films by Disney, but they put a happy ending in, whereas the original story didn't have a happy ending. That's, I think, had a big influence on the culture to believe that every story is going to end happily, and to create this kind of naive optimism. And I think that's really influenced the whole culture. And I don't want to blame Disney for all of that, but he's a little bit responsible for that. Optimism can be great, but also blind optimism can be really dangerous too. And it's good to remember that every ending is just a beginning anyway. If you don't like the ending, I know I often just fantasize about what I wish the ending was and change it in my head. But I did see the Japanese anime version of The Little Mermaid first, and so I know that she, spoiler alert, actually turns into sea foam at the end. Sorry to disappoint you. The National Film Board, other influences that I had growing up, when I was a teenager, I was obsessed with Much Music. That's the Canadian company that's similar to MTV. They bought a lot of the MTV programming, but they had a lot of their own original programs as well. And so watching music videos was also a huge influence. Not a lot of them are animated, but a lot of them are, non-narrative, very artistic films. You know, a lot of the only art films that some people have ever seen are music videos. They don't know that there's a whole world of art films out there that are maybe a little more unusual and have a little more fantasy in them. After I graduated from Concordia, I went back to Calgary and Quick Draw Animation, and I got involved there right away. I was on the board 3 times, and I made 3 films there. So basically, every time I went in to make a film, they said, "We need artists on the board. We need artists on the board." And so I signed up and got involved in all the crazy drama and everything. I think, though, now that I spoke to people at Quick Draw now, everything sounds so smooth and people are getting along so well. There's so much less drama, and there's just like a big appreciation for art, and it feels really good to know that the organization is in good hands. So, just a little bit about my 3 films that I finished independently. The first one is called Two, as I mentioned before, and it's all in black and white. I actually shot it on 16 millimeter black and white film, and I was able to hand process it myself, at least the negative, and it's pretty challenging to do the positive version as well on your own. There are still film developers out there that work with film. Sadly, there are a lot less now. The positive and negatives to film, there are a lot of them. The negatives are that it's expensive, that it involves some chemicals that are toxic, and it can be very heavy. If you have a full length feature film on film, you're going to have a big reel, and the cases they come in can be very heavy as well. The positives are that it's analog, and analog usually is a reflection, a direct reflection of what it's recording, as opposed to digital, which translates that image or that sound into digital information and then recreates it. So it can be a lot higher quality, and there's a lot of creative potential for film. Nowadays, the people that work with film are almost always also working with digital. You can take a film and transfer it to digital. You can take a digital image and transfer it to film. So you can go back and forth and you can make the best use of both of those worlds. My film The Fall, I was planning to do on film as well. I actually did some acetate cells, which you may have seen when you have a clear plastic or acetate um, paper, and you do your little character on it, and then you put it over top of the background so that you can see the background from behind. So I did a little bit of that, but I ended up finishing it on digital, mostly because of time constraints. The truth is that I feel that it's still not finished, and if I ever get a ton of money, I'm going to come back and finish it properly exactly the way I want. And then my last one was called Hold, and that was done actually completely digitally. And I used handheld video, and I used digital animation and rotoscoping. And rotoscoping is a technique where you actually animate using live action film and you draw over top of it, and then you can recreate it. It's was used for the film Waking Life. That's one example of it. Scanner Darkly is another one where they used rotoscoping. So my last film, Hold, was a combination of all of those things. And the word hold in animation has a specific meaning, which is for a static image. Of course, animation, usually everything's moving. But you can have a moving hold, which is when you have the same image that's slightly different, and then you repeat those different images that are the same but a little bit different, and it makes it look like what you're looking at is alive, because every living creature is moving all the time a little bit. We're always breathing. There's always a little bit of a vibration. And that's what makes handmade animation and hand-drawn animation or stop motion animation more realistic, even though the computer is so powerful. But the way that we move is more organically and a little irregularly. And so when you do hand-drawn or hand puppet animation, that you get that feeling that it's living. Whereas when you do digital animation, it's often very hard and it's very mechanical. So it looks more like a machine, even if you're doing a character animation. Now, there's been lots of changes in digital animation over the years to make it more and more realistic. I remember for me, the moment that I realized digital animation was really changing into something very magical and realistic was the movie Transformers, based on the old Transformers when I grew up, which was a TV show and a series of toys that transform from a person or a robot into a machine. A machine like a car that turns into like a humanoid robot. But the movie Transformers that came out in the 2000s, that was like, I was watching that and there was a moment where there's just explosion after explosion in the climax of the movie, and it was like an abstract film almost, and there was so much going on. And that film really, for me, was what showed me the transition that now we're making special effects that can actually trick people into believing that it's real. Because there was a while there where digital animation was really obvious and really different. But, as an artist, you realize that you train your eye to see certain things. And I'm sure there's things that I miss. Nowadays, we have to worry about deep fake videos and AI making new videos. And so you're never really sure what's real now. It's become much more blurry. And I think even in the news, when you believe the news, people make choices about what news to believe and what news to dismiss. I was surprised even when people were making the comparison between fake news and real news, and I thought, I stopped believing in real news ages ago. I don't believe anything for sure, but there's probably some truth to it, but there's almost always something missing. And that's because the situations that I was in when I read about it later in the newspaper, I thought, they really do make a lot of mistakes with the details, and then it's incredible how much false information can transfer from one person to another very easily. And unfortunately, we are easy to trick because a lot of people who invent these lies invent believable lies, just like animation. It's all fantasy, but it's believable. And that's because of how our brains work. So we want to believe certain things, and something like religion too is it's a fantasy, but you become convinced that it's real because our minds are just so powerful, and we really want to feel that that's true, even though we have no idea whether or not those things really happened or will happen. So you got to take it with a grain of salt. And I think sometimes when you realize how life is and that our brains are constantly perceiving and misperceiving information, every time you believe in something, it's a suspension of disbelief. So it's not so much if someone's telling you a story, you don't have to believe everything that they say. You don't have to not believe everything that they say. You just have to suspend your disbelief and go along with it and be like, maybe it will be true. Maybe it is true. You can't really know. And I think it's good to have the doubt that maybe it's not real, that maybe it's not true, and realize that everything is a bit of an illusion. That's how life is. We are part of reality and we are part of illusion, and we're just humans. So we have to understand the limitations to our own perceptions. Now, possibly if some other animal is watching our animation, maybe they'll pick up on things that we never even thought of. They can see colors we can't see. They can see vibrations that we can't see. And a lot of them see very quickly things that take us a little bit longer to see because we just move at a different pace. Back to the films that I finished. So after I finished them, I was able to go to a lot of different film festivals out there all over the world. That was one of my big goals because I loved traveling. Now I find traveling a little more exhausting, but at the time I really wanted to go travel and I really wanted to go back to Europe, and I was able to do that and enjoy the film festival atmosphere there. Animation film festivals are a little different than regular film festivals. They're a little more fun, they're a little weirder, they're a little more down to earth too at the same time. And every festival is different, but it's really interesting to be able to go to another country and enjoy this art form that is obscure enough that it really relies on the international community to be able to expand. So those international animation festivals are extremely important to the progress of animation, allowing people to get out there and see what's going on. And I hope that you're able to check out my website. It's KimberlyAnderson.com. That's Kimberly with an Ley. And on there, I do have my 3 animated films posted on Vimeo. So you can check those out. They're all really short, so you don't have to spend a lot of time even. Pretty much every film I've done has been under 5 minutes. That's the length that I like to work with. And I think that the possibilities are really endless. And I have a few ideas about, live action and animation together. I am working on a screenplay right now for a feature length live action film with quite a few special effects, more than just a little bit. So yeah, I'm not finished with it yet, but I'm very unlikely to go back to doing frame by frame myself ever. Remember, every technology has its own glitches, and the more complicated the technology, the more complicated the glitch. As much as people worry about robots taking over the world, I am much more worried about robots taking over the human mind. That's more dangerous. I think our belief in technology and our obsession with it is more dangerous than the technology itself. Most technology will just rust and fall apart with time if we don't give it energy. Literal energy like electricity or just maintenance. That's why our own machines just break so easily. So I'm not so worried about robots taking over. I'm just worried about humans forcing robots to do all the jobs that we're probably better at. And I think it would be better for us to understand what we're good at and use technology effectively, judiciously, in a efficient way rather than letting it take over our lives, but rather figure out what best way to use it in what situations, and to not use it at all if you don't have to, and you really don't have to use it all the time. There's this expectation that we should have technology in every single thing that we're doing, but that can be very weird. I went to one of the things that the animation reunion was at the platform, which is a new building, and the elevators are very strange. You have to input the number, and then you go into the elevator, and there's no numbers or different levels inside. I've been to another building like that as well, and it's incredibly unnerving because you feel like you have no control. And I think that that's the danger of technologies, that we're forcing people to use technology that we don't need simply in order to sell stuff. And that's something to think about with animation, is that the technology will not do everything for you, but you can learn to use the technology in a way that works for whatever your vision is. So if you're interested in animation and you're in the Calgary or Alberta area, definitely check out Quick Draw Animation Society. And hopefully you can take a look at my films and open your mind to different kinds of films out there and different kinds of visual effects that you may not know anything about. The more that you understand about the world and the illusions that are being fed to you, the more that you can avoid getting sucked in to the lies. Something to think about. Thanks for watching.